It was just like in a bad movie, you know, this guy sitting at a table with a bright light shining in your face, and you can sort of see him, but not quite. And he asked me name, rank, serial number, and I gave him that, and he says, and what kind of airplane you fly on? And I said, I can't tell you that. And he says, you can't tell me, or you won't tell me? And he says, I'm not sure it makes any difference. I said, but I'm not going to tell you. He picked up his 38, says, stuck it right up against my forehead. He says, now you tell me what kind of airplane you fly, or I kill you. I said, okay, go ahead. And you know, you get to a place of stupidity because you're in shock and you don't know what the next question is or what the right answer is, and you don't become brave. You do what you've been taught to do, and you've been taught to not tell them. And so, fortunately, he didn't shoot me.
Following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, nearly 600 prisoners of war boarded U.S. Air Force C-141s in February and March at Jeollam Airfield in Hanoi for Operation Homecoming. 50 years later, 8 of those former POWs have returned to Hanoi to commemorate their flights to freedom. Air Force Captain Robert Surton, a navigator aboard a B-52, was shot down December 18, 1972 during the opening night of Operation Linebacker 2 and released March 29, 1973, spending 101 days in prison. Surton had not returned to Southeast Asia since the 1973 release, and like others on the trip, he was curious to see more of the country than just the inside of a prison cell.
Well, it started out as kind of a wild hair, actually, but 50th anniversaries are all really kind of big deals. My wife and I just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary in May. We were married just before I was deployed to Guam, and so this is another 50, and we're all getting a little bit older. You know, I'm 75 now, and so this is basically the last opportunity that I would have to travel to Asia. And to go back and see how Vietnam and Cambodia are now, this 50 years after the end of the war, how their people are. They're a big trading partner with the U.S. now. And so it seemed like a good opportunity.
I had no desire to come back, especially to Hanoi. But
Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade Bill Shankle, an A-4 pilot, was shot down on December 23, 1965, and released on February 12, 1973, spending 2,609 days, over 7 years, in captivity.
Well, I heard about it, 3 years ago or more, before COVID hit and all that, and I thought, well, that might be a good thing. Because I'd never really been to Saigon before, and certainly never been to Cambodia or whatnot, and I thought, well, and I'd had plenty of friends, and I knew other ex-POWs that had been back there, some of them a couple of times.
Some of the other guys came back, and part of their report of what they experienced over there is one of the reasons I thought I'd like to go back too, because it was a positive experience for them. The first ambassador to Vietnam when we reestablished relationships was a former POW.
Air Force Lieutenant Ed Hubbard, an EB-66C navigator, was shot down July 20th, 1966, and released March 4th, 1973, spending 2,420 days, more than 6 years, in prison.
First time I went back because I wanted to see my cell. I wanted to see the first cell I ever lived in, and I wanted to see if it was as gruesome as I thought it was, and when I got there, it was exactly as I remembered it. This time I'm going back because Wayne told me there was a tour, and I looked at the tour, and I saw the itinerary ended on the 4th of March, and I thought, there is no way this is coincidence. This has got to be done. You got to go back so I can fly out twice on the same day, 50 years apart. That's what that, and then kind of a sidelight is going to Cambodia because I've always wanted to see Angkor Wat and that stuff. So that's one of the reasons, primary as a photographer, that's what I've got to see. But the real reason I'm going is so I can make that flight out of Hanoi on the 4th.
I know that when we get to the Hilton, they'll probably tell everybody that what a wonderful time. You know, what a wonderful time we had, and how easy they were for us, and whatnot. And so I'm prepared for that. And I'll just, because it's going to be on probably some 21-year-old girl who didn't even remember the war was on, you know, and that's fine. I understand.
Air Force Captain Pete Camerata, a B-52 electronic warfare officer, was shot down December 22, 1972, and released March 29, 1973. Camerata spent 12 days evading capture and was imprisoned for 86 days.
This is my first time to Vietnam. Never really had an interest. Even this, I wasn't interested in South Vietnam because I've never been there. I've only flown over and dropped bombs on it. Sort of interested in the Hanoi portion. I've had the opportunity to come back, and I have no real reason to. I have nothing against the people, except the political advisor, political officer who said that I wasn't a prisoner of war. I was a war criminal, and we were going to be shot. I'd like to meet him with my Louisville Slugger, but the rest of them, they're doing their job too, just like I was, I think, and I don't have any animosity against anybody, but I don't want to become buddy-buddy with anybody either. I got enough people that I don't see enough of that are my friends, so it's not a problem being here, but it wasn't something that was really high on my bucket list, okay?
Air Force Captain David Drummond, a B-52 co-pilot, was shot down December 22, 1972, and released March 29, 1973, spending 98 days in captivity.
Yeah, this is the first time I had been back to Vietnam since the release, and a couple of things motivated it. Always curious to see what it was going to be like after all this time. I'd heard good things about the place. Plus, my wife had never seen Vietnam, and she was interested in seeing it and thought it would be good for me to come back and see the place. And then when Bob put this trip together, I said, this is the opportunity for that, and I took advantage of it.
And I think that it's going to be sort of the final healing, if you will, closure, maybe is a better word, for what we did once upon a time long, long ago.
I learned the tap code, so I started tapping on the wall at the guy next door, a guy named Jim Young, who had been shot down about a month before me. And his prior assignment before he was flying was down in Saigon, and he tapped on the wall. He said, straight from the horse's mouth, from the 4-star commander, the 90 days after we bombed Hanoi the first time, the war will be over. Well, I flew on the mission when we bombed Hanoi the first time, and that was 30 days ago, roughly. And so I knew, we only had about 70 days going. I said, Christ, I can do this standing on my head. 6 years later, I moved into a cell with Jim Young, and I said, do you remember back in 1966, you told me we'd be out in 90 days? I said, my head has really gotten sore since then.
They wanted information or whatever, and I think mostly they just wanted to be mean. And because they had me sitting on a stool, my knee was this big around, and they asked me for my name, rank, service number, and date of birth. And I said, well, that's all you're going to get, because that's all we're supposed to give according to the Geneva Convention. And that's when they informed me that I wasn't a prisoner of war, I was a war criminal and had no rights.
Air Force Major Dewey Wayne Waddell, an F-105 pilot, was shot down July 5, 1967, and released March 4, 1973, spending 2,070 days, or 5.5 years, in prison.
Sitting on the floor, the guard would put like this, like you're sitting yogi style, and he would kneel down on his shoulders, and it we had this let down strap, nylon straps, heavy duty strap. He'd start that from your elbow, come around this side, go around your ankles, come back the other side of your neck, tight back to the elbows, and then when he stepped off, your body did this, and that closed in here. Boom, I passed out.
And then they took me out that night for my first serious interrogation. And that's when I get to do the, how many ropes can you tie around your, if you look right here, you see this scar right there? That's made 50 years ago, 56 years ago by the ropes the first night I was there. And both my arms were completely paralyzed for 7 months after I got out of the ropes. So it was a bad experience.
They turned my knee upside down or my foot upside down. I was looking at my heel, and then they from where my elbows were tied together, hooked a rope to a hook in the ceiling and lifted me off the stool. So I decided I could tell them more than name, rank, service number, and date of birth.
The thing I figured out, really, or I assume everybody did, is that within about the first month or maybe 2 months, they had no interest in military information. 100% of their effort was to get propaganda, had nothing to do with the war.
Well, we did the best you could, because eventually if you give somebody enough pain, they're going to break. And it was just, get over it the best you can and get better, and the next time they ask you for something, make them work for it again.
We fed them this innocuous bullshit that they loved. When I showed them the wiring diagram, they said, "Do you understand?" He said, "Oh, yes, I understand." I said, "Okay, no further explanation needed." And so we spent an awful lot of time trying to stay out of trouble by doing stuff that made no difference.
We all put up with the torture, and some guys had different approaches or different gimmicks, to especially when you're in put me in a hole in the ground at night with the rats and the mosquitoes and everything else, and handcuffed, and I couldn't move and everything else, and so I got through it because I like jazz, and so I just did a whole lot of Stan Kenton and Dave Brubeck while I'm sitting in the hole in the ground, just and figuring, let's take about an hour to play one LP, and so I do one LP, and then I do another tenor, and that's how I got through it, and I don't know how other people did it.
Trouble. Anyway, I ended up in solitary confinement in a little building we called the outhouse, and that's where I spent my Christmas. When I was sitting there, I was walking back and forth this little 6-foot square cell, talking to myself all day. And one day I was trying to figure out, I thought I was going to die in that cell. I really didn't know if I was ever going to get out of there. And while I was pacing the floor, I remembered that story I heard when I was a little kid, about the man felt sorry for himself because he had no shoes, and then he met a guy that had no feet. And with that simple thought, I was able to sit down, I was able to convince myself 99% of the people in the world had it worse than I did. And it was because of that I was able to make conscious decision. I was going to survive. I was never going to sit and feel sorry for myself again, and I would never allow myself to have another bad day the rest of my life. And that's 56 years ago. I don't do bad days. Haven't done a bad day since December of '66.
There was no guarantees anyway. That you just never know. But I was more confident that we would all be released, and I knew that the treatment, as long as you didn't do anything really, I don't heard of nobody in our group that really did push them over the line where the North Vietnamese would torture them or do anything like extended periods in solitary. I mean, I was in solitary for the first, I think, almost 3 weeks, which when you think about, compare that with some of these guys that were in solitary almost their entire time, those kind of things, that was easy for me. So if those guys did it for X number of time, I could do it for another day. That's kind of the way I approached it.
I kind of forget what the question was. I have to go back with what Bill says. It was, you wanted to live. I gave myself up after 12 days, and I debated about it because I was either going to be the live coward or the dead hero up on my little hillside, and I wanted to live.
I didn't know what to expect during the capture sequence out in the countryside. The civilians were pretty hostile, but the militia protected me from harm. Once we got into the Hanoi Hilton, then I really felt kind of safe because even though I was blindfolded, I could look up underneath it and saw the big arched entry. And the interrogation was straight out of the playbook. I didn't know that torture had ended, but it had. Torture ended about the time Ho Chi Minh died.
Ho Chi Minh, president of North Vietnam, died in Hanoi.
This happened in fall of '69, all about the same time. First thing that happened in the spring, we had, there was a young seaman who had fallen overboard off his boat and got captured and came to North Vietnam, a guy named Doug Hegdal. And we pumped him full of information, and there were certain events occurred when they would prematurely release people. 3 guys got out, then 3 more guys got out. I think Doug was in the 3rd group that got out, but we had filled his brain with every single piece of knowledge. And he came back to America and told the government all the things that we had taught him in prison. And so they built a pretty good pile of information about how brutally we were being treated. And they put that out to the public. And at that time, the wives of the guys in jail all got together and they started trumpeting this thing. Everybody in America started writing letters to the mailbox in Paris where the peace talks were going on. And I think the Vietnamese suddenly realized that they had probably pressed us too far. And they wanted to find a graceful way out. So when Ho Chi Minh died, they said, well, it was his fault. He's the one that did that. And the treatment changed almost instantly, overnight.
Someone was told that after Ho Chi Minh died is when the Army took over. Up to that time, we had been under the political portion of the Army. Now, the regular Army did. That's when we got towels, we got socks, we got an extra blanket. Christmas time, we got checkers. Yeah, packages started coming in after that.
Following the river cruise, the group arrived in Hanoi. They made their way along streets bustling with people and traffic and flanked by both the French architecture they saw on their way from prison to the airport in 1973, alongside new high-rise buildings and familiar Western company logos, symbols of Vietnam's ascendance in the world economy. The group stopped at the John McCain marker near the lake where the future senator crashed and was pulled from the water badly injured. They made their way through the old French Quarter and stopped at a few other spots. The B-52 Victory Museum held special interest for the former B-52 crew members in the group.
Remember, they're seeing this as the Dien Bien Phu of the Air, where they drove the Americans out of Vietnam. Yeah. So, and as they say, they're the only countries ever shot down a B-52. Yeah. So they're pretty proud of that. Yeah. We tell the story from our point of view too. Yeah. It's a little different. Yeah. So we, and I understand that. I have no problem with how they tell their story. That's their point of view. There's my name. There it is. Right here. Quick, somebody take a picture.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay. I see.
I never said that.
What?
Any of this. I didn't say any of that.
But it's in black and white. You must have.
It was terribly
We
unexpected and scared.
didn't say that. I never said any of that stuff. They made that up.
Think so?
I know so. I have good memory, a very distinct memory of that experience in my life. Yeah, what I really said was nothing. I refuse to talk. I'm just a celestial navigator, only navigate over water. When we get over land, the radar navigator takes over. They said, we know you know. You're plenty smart. You tell us what we want to know.
Your face?
That's me.
Oh my God, you here?
Yeah,
You look handsome.
I was. Time has taken its toll. I had hair.
Oh my God.
And it was orange.
The most meaningful stop of the visit was what remains of Hoa Lo Prison, the so-called Hanoi Hilton. The prison, built by the French in the 19th century, is now a museum, and most of the original structures are long gone, replaced by a high-rise building full of shops and apartments. As they make their way through the exhibits, most of them dedicated to the harsh treatment of the Vietnamese at the hands of the French, the POWs look for anything familiar. They gather around a model of the prison, pointing out the now non-existent cells where they were held. Heartbreak Hotel, Little Vegas, New Guy Village. Most of it is gone, though, and what's left, especially of the American experience, is a little sanitized. The model cells a little more spacious than they remember.
Yeah.
Some more?
Well, this is too big.
Too big.
That's too big.
Too big.
These are all much larger than the Heartbreak.
There was not much space between the beds when I, but you get the idea. So,
And then on the 26th of December, when the really heavy bombing happened all at once, Alex climbed under the bunk, and I stayed up here. And he said he was afraid the ceiling would collapse and you'd get injured. And I said, if it does, I'll get killed, and I'd rather die than get injured over here because there's no medical care. It's not very good for American prisoners, especially B-52 guys.
The former guests of the Hanoi Hilton finally have an opportunity to show their wives and family the settings of so many of their stories.
and I look at that map, I don't know where the heck I was, because everywhere you went, they were blindfolded, and so I'm not sure where Desert Inn and Stardust and those places were. First time here, spent 6 weeks in Heartbreak Hotel, and then they took me to a place called the Zoo. And then after what they call the Hanoi March, that was in July of '66. They asked me the next day what I thought of it. I said, well, the people were uncontrollable. You ought to do something about that. And they said I had a bad attitude, and that night they took me out to a place called the Briar Patch. And the Briar Patch, I forget how many were out there, but there were just nine buildings with maybe 4 cells in a building. And all I can remember is that that was the worst place I ever was. The Briar Patch was so bad that even the guards had diarrhea.
How does it feel seeing yourself in a museum?
Well, it makes me feel old, as well as brings back some unpleasant memories, but at least I'm leaving it behind. I'm not carrying it with me for the rest of my life. That was one of the purposes of coming here.
Gonna take a picture of you, sir? Sure.
Just shoot me. I mean, yes, take a picture.
Thank you.
For the former POWs on this trip, it feels like they all left their wars behind. If not when they climbed aboard those C-141s in the spring of '73, then sometime in the intervening decades. That is not to say their days in the Hanoi Hilton didn't leave scars, physical or otherwise, or that a sense of closure was not an objective for some as they returned to Vietnam. But they all seem to possess a kind of comfort with the past, their eyes open to the future, and a reverence for those who were not as lucky to come home.
I was very lucky. I lived with over the period of time I was in prison, I lived with some incredibly brilliant people who gave me advice because I was young and stupid, and they took advantage of me. And one of the guys that I lived with, Jack Van Loan, took me aside one day. I had gotten into a minor fight with another prisoner who hit my jump rope when I was jumping rope, and I was going for the world record, and he came by and stuck his finger. I intentionally knocked the rope out of my hand. It really, really irked me. And Jack Van Loan took me aside and he says, when you leave here, don't take any of this stuff with you. Go home and enjoy life and, learn to live with it. And he says, don't waste your time hating the Vietnamese because they're just doing their job. And so I kind of took that serious. And so I came back and I tried seriously to never, ever have any animosity or dislike for the Vietnamese people. So but I watched other people, other ex-POWs who did have tremendous animosity, who wouldn't have gone back to Vietnam if you'd have given them a free ride and they're a private jet. And I watched their negative things, how it affected their daily life, and I saw mine, and I thought, Christ, I don't want to ever go down that road with those guys. And so when I went to Vietnam, I went there to see all of it, because when I was there, the only thing I saw in Vietnam was the inside of a prison, so it wasn't that good a deal. But I wanted to see the whole country. Everybody told me how beautiful it was and everything, and the people were wonderful. And I was fortunate because I had this guide whose father had gone through 6 years of re-education after we left. And so this guy knew exactly how life had been because his father had explained it to him very clearly. And so he was a super nice kid. He couldn't do enough for you. And he knew where we'd been, and he wanted to show us the other side of Vietnam, the good side. And so I quite enjoyed the trip. The trip back to Hanoi to go down to the Hilton and walk in and sit in this cell was kind of a highlight. One of the guys had smuggled a big magnum of champagne over to the prison, and he had it in the car with the guide. So when we walked out the front door of the Wallow prison, we opened the champagne and we all toasted the 58,000 guys who weren't lucky enough to go to jail.
What I did and what we did was really nothing extraordinary. It's something that anybody could do if they had to. It's just nice to not have to do that.
I'm a glasses half full kind of person. I think even before this, but this magnified it for me personally. That whenever you feel bad, I like to quote my friend Paul Galani, says that you're never having a bad day as long as there's a doorknob on the inside of the door.
For me, it's been a positive experience, and it's so good to have all these other people with us. You know, going to what's left of the Wallow prison, the Hanoi Hilton, was less moving than I had hoped for, because every place that I was held was gone. You know, they had just the front entrance, and then what we called a portion of what we called New Guy Village off to one side, which I was never in. But the dungeon cells back there were similar to where I was in what we call the Heartbreak Hotel. So I was able to show Robbie what the cells kind of looked like during that time. And that was one of the things I'd hoped for, was to share more completely with my wife Robbie about what that 100 days was like and what it meant to me and coming home. And I think things affected her in a different way than it did me. You know, the Vietnamese now that we've met here, and from Saigon to Hanoi, have been very pleasant, friendly. It's like the general last night saying, when we were warriors, we did what the leadership told us to do. But when the war ended, we're not enemies anymore. So now when we meet, we can be friends. And that's been my attitude a long time. So we never took it personally.
That we were just overwhelmed with this. The welcome mat was, to say it's a red carpet, was not even a start to the conversation. And our problem, mine and others that told me, was how to respond. All of a sudden, we're heroes. And that was difficult. We're survivors. Many of our guys did heroic things. But the only heroes in Vietnam are the names on the black wall. We were fortunate enough to come back, do the toast, and be survivors.
Before we finish here, I'd like to ask you to do something for me. When I speak all over the country, I always ask people to join me in what we did in prison that really solidified our existence. We had church call. Whether you were religious or otherwise, we had church call at about 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Everybody in North Vietnam honored church call, all of the Americans. And we honored church call, and we did Pledge of Allegiance. We did the Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm, and then we sang God Bless America. And so I end every place I speak asking the audience, stand up, join me singing God Bless America. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam, DNA stands for God Bless America. We tapped that on the wall before we went to bed every night to the guy next door. Make sure nobody forgot why we were there, how important it is to do the best that you know how, and get up to bar ready to do it better. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
She asked me about it, and I said, Vietnam War saved my life. That 7 years I would have been just chasing women and drinking whiskey and smoking cigars. I could have been killed.